Shalom. Today I want to start off with 3 questions that seem unrelated, but that we're going to discover are very intricately connected in different passages in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. So the first question is there a point in the life of David HaMelech, of King David, where he performs human sacrifice? And of course, at one level, we know the answer is no. But there is a point in the narrative where it's quite a curious set of events. And if you look at it the right way, you could make that accusation. And that's a very interesting problem in the text that I think we want to examine. That's an interesting subject on its own, which we'll get into first. A totally seemingly separate, unrelated question is, what is this thing that happens with Yehoshua when the sun and the moon seem to stop in the sky? So in the book of Yehoshua, there's one of the many battles of the conquest of Canaan that Yehoshua is leading. And there's this famous moment where he calls for the sun and the moon to halt in the sky. And there's a great miracle from Hashem, seemingly, and they halt in the sky and they defeat their enemies. What's going on there? Why is that the special moment where that gets to happen? And it is not on its face a question you would normally ask, what does that have to do with David performing human sacrifice? But I'm going to ask that question because actually it turns out I think those passages are intimately related in a way that we're going to see. And by reading them next to each other, we may come to understand a little bit better a few different issues in Tanakh that are running through a whole lot of it. And, to cap it off, I think a summary question you could say this all comes back to in the Torah itself is, what does it mean to do that which is straight and good in the eyes of Hashem? Why does the Torah have that formula, hayashar ve'atov be'enei Adonai, as a thing that you can do? Ve'asita hayashar ve'atov be'enei Adonai is, I don't know if you would classify it itself as a mitzvah. You should do that which is straight and good in the eyes of Hashem. But many people talk about it as a kind of principle that covers all the gaps in the Torah, where you could say, if there's somehow a way you could figure out how to do something bad, even though the Torah has lots of prohibitions, but there's still some way in which doing something that's obviously kind of nasty or terrible is technically permitted. It's not permitted because there's this stopgap where the Torah says, no, do that which is straight and good in the eyes of Hashem. So know what's right, and you're responsible also for doing that. You're not allowed to use loopholes to do wickedness. And so that also is a subject on its own that's interesting. But I think it's also connected with these two questions. And the most sort of esoteric textual hint that you can look for is the mention of something called the Book of Jasher, as it's translated quasi-comically into English. This is Sefer Hayashar. So when the sun stood with Yehoshua, we have Weidom HaShemesh U'Yareach Amad Ad Ikom Goy Oivav Halo hi ktuva al Sefer Hayashar Vayamod HaShemesh B'Chatzi HaShamayim V'lo Atz Lavo Keyom Tamim. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Yashar? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day. So there are various things in the translation of that pasuk that we'll return to and maybe we'll want to translate differently. But there's just as mentioned, the book of Jasher, or really Sefer HaYashar, which in Hebrew you might read as the straight book or the book of the straight. Yashar means straight. And that phrase, Sefer HaYashar, appears in one other place in Tanakh. And it is in this song that David sings to mourn Shaul and Yonatan. So when Shaul and Yonatan die and David hears of it, he composes this lamentation that begins, Wayomer lelamed bnei Yehuda cheshet, hine ktuva al sefer hayeshar. And he said, to teach the sons of Judah the use of the bow, behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. And then he sings the song to mourn Shaul and Yonatan, who died in the mountains of Gilboa, which we can return to. Or at least, we have mentioned the mountains of Gilboa here, but I think it's because they died in the mountains of Gilboa. So now we have two mentions of this book, whatever it is, the book of Jasher. I've interestingly heard it suggested that really that it's not the word yashar that we should be looking at. We should be looking for the shoresh of shir or shira, of singing, that this is really like a book of songs. And it's some kind of collection of ballads of war or songs of great warriors or great events that didn't get canonized in Tanakh, but it's referred to in Tanakh. That would go a long way towards explaining what goes on with Yehoshua in this sense, because what it's saying is you're actually reading psukim that are from some song of memory, and so maybe it sort of exaggerates what actually happens or talks about it very poetically in the way that David's song is talking. And so that's one interesting suggestion, but I'm interested in Hayashar as a word eventually. But for now, let's just kick things off. And this is going to be a lengthy analysis. There are these two seemingly unrelated events: the death of Shaul and Yonatan, and really a song about who Shaul was, who King Shaul was, a eulogy of him by David on the one hand, and on the other hand, this moment with Yehoshua, where the son of the moon seemingly stopped at his command, or Hashem listens to his command and stops the son of the moon. And they're both written in the book of Yashar, which seems like trivia. It seems like it doesn't matter. It's not connected with anything in particular that's going on here. But then we start to pull at the threads a little bit, and there are other things that are connected about these passages, or not these passages, let's say these two different topics. There's the topic of, as we mentioned, this strange event with David maybe performing human sacrifice, which we'll unpack in a second, and this event with Yehoshua, with the sun and the moon. It turns out there's another detail there, which is the point of connection that we're going to care about a lot. And that is what are called the Givonim. The Givonim are people that in the time of Yehoshua, they were Canaanites who were impressed by the might of the armies of Israel and frightened by Hashem. And they decided they just wanted to switch sides. But they knew they wouldn't be accepted switching sides if they just said, hey, we're Canaanim, because there's this command that the Israelites had to just wipe out the Canaanim. So they got some dilapidated water bags and shoes, and they feigned having traveled from a long way away and said, oh, hey, we're from definitely not Canaan, some other place, but we heard that you're in charge here now, and we're afraid of you and your God, and we want to join sides. And they swore an oath, and only after they swore that oath, along with the Israelites, and yet Yehoshua authorized, then is it revealed that they're Canaanites. And so because of the strength of the oath, they couldn't be wiped out or destroyed. And so then they become these servants to the Israelites in a way that's more specific than just being what you would call a ger toshav. A ger toshav is a Gentile who lives in the land of Israel and accepts the sovereignty of Hashem and the sovereignty of the Torah, and is a Judaic monotheist who is not a Jew and therefore isn't bound by all the commandments of the Torah, but is an accepting participant in the Judaic system. So that's a ger toshav. The Givonim were not just gerim toshavim, because they, in addition to everything that would apply to a ger toshav, they had sworn this special oath of service, and they became something more closely connected with Bnei Israel as a result. What it says is, "Vayifnem Yehoshua beyomahu hotvei etzim v'shoavei mayim le'ida u'lemizbach Adonai ad hayom hazeh el hamakom asher yibhar." So Yehoshua made them wood choppers and water bearers or water drawers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, even to this day, in the place which he should choose. So they become very attached to the tabernacle in some sense. And that is maybe, it's therefore not so surprising that later when Solomon has this dream in advance of the establishment of the first temple in Jerusalem, he has it in Givon, or, he sort of, he visits Hashem and receives this revelation or has this conversation with Hashem about the temple for Hashem in Givon. Or let's say sort of a dream that's a precursor to all of that takes place in Givon. And Givon it remains associated, therefore, with, the idea of Avodat Hashem and the temple, though in the time of Yeshua is the tabernacle. But the point is that these aren't just Gentiles who live in the land. They've become this kind of indentured servants of the temple. So it's like an even closer relationship. I'll note as an aside, we can return to this point maybe in due course, that this thing specifically of being wood choppers and water drawers is very precise. And it's interesting because we first encounter it actually in Sefer Dvarim. So in Sefer Dvarim, the point is being made that the Torah is for everyone. That it's not just for, who knows, some kind of rabbinic elite or some kind of scholarly class. The Torah is for every, it seems at the time, member of the Israelite nation. That is the sense in which the Torah seems to be speaking. It says, "Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem, roshechem, shivtechem, ziknechem, v'shotrechem, kol ish Yisrael." You stand this day before the Lord your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders, your officers, with all the men of Israel. Tapchem neshechem v'gercha asher b'kerev mahanecha mehotev eitzecha ad shoev memecha. Your little ones, your wives, your stranger who's in your camp, from the hewer of your wood to the drawer of your water. And never before did it seem obvious to me in that pasuk that the ger who is in your camp is connected with the wood chopper and water bearer. It sounded more like, there's your little ones, your wives. It seemed almost like it's listing miscellaneous kinds of people who maybe are not the most powerful people in your ancient patriarchal system. They're not officers, they're not elders, they're not captains. They are children or women, or also maybe strangers. But the ger maybe could have been a convert to the Torah, right? A ger tzedek. But then it goes on, the wood chopper, water drawer, and you suddenly think, now knowing that the Givonim are referred to this way, that maybe the ger is also referring to a ger toshav, and particularly the Givonim, meaning that there are people who may not even be bound by, all the mitzvot, who are kind of standing here with you. They're part of your society. They're not the strongest parts of your society. They're the most vulnerable parts of your society, but they're here. And it's a little confusing in Dvarim because then it's, all about you're entering into this covenant with Hashem. And so it seems like at the time it's referring to people who are bound by all the mitzvot. But clearly that phrasing is then rehashed for the Givonim to say, look, these people are not Jews, they're not Israelites, they're not bound by the Torah, but they're bound to the Torah. So they may as well be. Like, they really went all in with you. They didn't even just say, I want to be a sort of inconspicuous citizen of the land. They came to you, they tricked you into letting them become a part of your project, and they dedicated themselves to serving Hashem in their way by serving in the temple, or doing the wood chopping and the water drawing, so to speak. So that is who the Givonim are, and the Givonim are going to figure in the story of Shaul and David and the sons of Shaul on the one hand, and they're going to figure in the story of Yehoshua on the other hand. It's a little confusing the way I've set this up because I said, okay, the Sefer HaYeshar, that's the connection between Shaul and Yonatan and David on the one hand, and Yehoshua and the sun and the moon on the other. But then I mentioned this particular episode with David where he does something that looks like human sacrifice. This actually is a moment involving Shaul and his sons and the Givonim. So we'll explain that one now, and it'll become clearer how we want to weave this all together eventually. But so you have to hold a little bit in your head at once. Where we are right now is there's this strange connection between Yehoshua and his story with the sun and the moon, and Shaul and his sons, and David on the other hand, and the Givonim, these people, these special people who are not Israelites and not bound by the Torah, but bound to Am Hashem and bound to Avodat Hashem in their way. So how do we make sense of this? And we will have to kind of deepen the objective data a bit, just showing the connection first before we can explain it all. But there's some opportunity to comment as an aside in the meantime when we look at this episode with David. So what happens with David? What is this strange episode that I keep, accusing David of what I'm calling human sacrifice? Where does this come from? Okay, so the situation is there is a famine. It says, "Vayhi ra'av b'yamei David shalosh shanim shana acharei shana vayvakesh David et panei Adonai vayomer Adonai el Shaul ve'el beit hadamim al asher hemit et hagivonim." So there was a famine in the days of David, 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, "It is for Shaul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Givonim." So this is already perplexing because we don't have an episode in the life and times of Shaul HaMelech where it says, and then Shaul went and he decided to kill the Givonim. We can maybe guess that what happened because we know about the Givonim. We already said who they are, and they're attached to the tabernacle and facilitating the service of the priests, maybe doing the wood chopping and the water drawing for that, right? That maybe this has to do with something Shaul did that involved the priests. In particular, Shaul ordered the whole city of Nov with all the Kohanim there to be slaughtered because David had visited there and he was suspicious of them because they helped David at the time. So that's not explicitly stated here, but it's like a reasonable supposition, assuming that Shaul did kill Givonim. And it says, "Vayikra melech leGivonim, vayomer alehem, ve'aGivonim lo mibnei Yisrael hema ki im meyeter ha'emori u'bnei Yisrael nishbe'u lahem, vayivakesh Shaul lehakotham b'kan'oto livnei Yisrael ve'Yehuda." So the king called the Givonites, or the Givonim, and said to them, Now, the Givonim were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. It's an aside. It's kind of a strange, it cuts off. Now the Givonim were not of the people of Israel, but were remnant of the Amorites, and the people of Israel had sworn to them, and Shaul sought to slay them in his zeal to the people of Israel and Yehudah. So the fact that it mentions Yehudah specifically, that also is about his suspicion of David at the time when Shaul was going around killing people, trying to prevent David from coming to power. And so it's reasonable to suppose that this is a sort of oblique reference to Shaul slaughtering the Kohanim of Nov, and along with them, I guess, everyone that was there. I mean, it says at the time they really, killed women and children and lambs. They slaughtered everything that was there. These rabble led by Doeg Adomi who are working for Shaul, and so because of that, the Givonim maybe would have been swept up in that and also killed. So now David is being told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu through some mechanism. He's consulting directly with Hashem, using the ephod or whatever means he has. He's king at this point in the story. And the answer is, it's because of what Shaul did to the Givonim. So now the nation is being punished with 3 years of famine, which is presumably devastating and deadly. People are dying of starvation. 3 years of famine, and famine is no joke. We're talking, 3,000 years ago. So you have people dying left and right from famine. David consults, and he has an answer directly from Hashem. It's because of Shaul and what Shaul did to the Givonim. So now David goes to the Givonim. It says, Vayomer David el ha-Givonim ma aseh lachem uvema achaper uvarchu et nahalat Adonai. Therefore David said to the Givonim, what shall I do for you, and what shall I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And then the Givonim give their answer, which is a very difficult one. They say, and I'll just say in English in order to go a bit more swiftly. And the Givonim said to him, we will have no silver nor gold from Shaul, nor from his house, neither for us shall you kill any man in Israel. And he said, what you shall say, what will I do for you? And they answered, the king, the man who consumed us and who plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the borders of Israel. Let 7 men of his sons be delivered to us, and we will hang them up to the Lord in Giv'ah of Shaul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, meaning David said, I will give them. So stop right there. They're demanding to kill 7 sons of Shaul. And already that sounds like a problem from various standpoints. First of all, because you have this explicit idea elsewhere in Tanakh that you don't punish the sons for the sins of the father, you don't punish the father for the sins of the son. And it seems here like that's exactly what's being done here. It's very easy to imagine these sons of Shaul as completely uninvolved, unrelated, innocent people, and they're just being offered up to be killed because of something that Shaul did, and that's very terrible and hard to take. Even just when we think of it from the standpoint of you're murdering people, that's not okay. And on top of that, there's this very strange alacrity with which David is described as doing this. The king said, I will give them. Like, that's not so much effort. Now, there are midrashim that make this more complicated, where David tries, as he might, to convince them to take something else, and he remarks that they're, a cruel people, that they're insisting that this is the only thing that can placate them. But the text doesn't put all that in. That's Chazal kind of complicating David's persona, but in the text here, he just says, I'll give them. And then it goes on to say, وَيَحْمُلَ الْمَلَكْ عَلْ مِפِبּושeth ben Yonatan ben Shaul al shvu'at Adonai asher benotham ben David uven Yonatan ben Shaul. The king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Yonatan, the son of Shaul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Yonatan, the son of Shaul. So there's a son of Yonatan named Mephibosheth, who is lame, and David has him eat at his table, and Mephibosheth is grateful to him, and it's a very beautiful story, that David does something to protect Mephibosheth out of love of Yonatan, which is not to be taken for granted, because kings consolidate their rule, and maybe what you should be doing is, killing all of the descendants of the former king if you just became king. But David doesn't kill Mephibosheth. He honors him and he protects him. But it goes on to say, but the king, which is David, although it's interesting that it's not saying David, it's like the text is distancing itself from what's happening here. The same way that, when things happen that are good to Achav, it's like Melech Yisrael, because the text doesn't want to say that Hashem was helping Achav. But here it's like uncomfortable to admit that David is the one doing this, so it's the king, Hamelech. But the king took the two sons of Ritzpah, the daughter of Aya, whom she bore to Shaul, Armoni and Mephibosheth. So there's a different Mephibosheth here. And the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Shaul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mecholati. So this is even stranger, because Michal was David's wife. The text elsewhere explicitly says she has no children till the day she dies. And so that's also a problem to resolve here. And so this is also grandchildren now of Shaul. They're not sons of Shaul. They are 5 grandsons of Shaul by his daughter. We'll return to the issue of Michal in a second. And then there's one of them named Mephibosheth, who's not his, the son of Yonatan, Mephibosheth, the grandson. It's a son of Shaul named Mephibosheth, who is a son by his Pilegesh, his concubine. So you have these 7 men who are being given to be killed and hung up by the Givonim. And he delivers them to the Givonim, and then the mother of some of them goes to protect their bodies, and David is impressed by this, and he realizes he should take their bones and the bones of Shaul and Yonatan and collect them into an ancestral family bone cave. And so that's how the story ends up. So it's hard to even know where to begin with the problems in the text here, but and I'll just mention one last little detail which seems completely irrelevant, but we will establish that it's extremely relevant later. It says, "Vayitnem beyad hagivonim, vayok'om behar lifnei Adonai, vayiplu shiva'atam yahad, vehema humthu b'yemei qatzir berishonim, bethilat qatzir se'orim." And he delivered them to the hands of the Givonim, and they hanged them in the hill before the Lord, and they fell all 7 together and were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, that barley harvest detail seems unimportant. It's actually very important. The harvest aspect makes sense because this is a famine that we're trying to fix. But now, okay, so I have legion problems with the text here. One is this issue of Michal being the mother, seemingly, of 5 grandsons of Shaul, even though the text elsewhere says about Michal that she never had children until the day she died. That's one problem. Another problem is David's, willingness to cooperate here, or not even just like the fact that it's very easy for him, but also like how could he possibly agree to this at all? It seems like murder of innocent people. David usually would balk at doing, much less to people, and so we have to ask that kind of question. And then there's just the overall structure of this when you look at it from start to finish. So let's start there. There's a famine in the land. The king inquires of the deity, how do we stop the famine? an answer is given that there are these people who are attached to the sacrificial cult for the service of the deity, right? The Givonim serve the temple through their commitment to being woodchoppers and water bearers since the time of Yeshua. So Givonim are not random people. They are temple people in some sense. So the king inquires of the deity, how do we make the famine stop? What's the source of the famine? The answer is given that it's because the temple people need to be appeased. And when the temple people are consulted, their answer is, we need 7 sons of the former king to be brought and killed. And then the famine can't abate, right? And so that just sounds like human sacrifice, and not just human sacrifice of any kind. It sounds like very, if you describe the details only in those very bare terms, it sounds like you have a fertility god, you're trying to make the earth fertile, you have these princes of your nation who are selected as human sacrifices to be given to the temple people to kill so that you can make the earth fertile again and end the famine, right? It just, from start to finish, the details line up in a way where the bare set of events could be described in slightly different language, and you would just say, oh, that's ancient pagan human sacrifice, exactly what the Torah is totally against. And yet in this case, it's David HaMelech doing it, first of all. Second of all, it's triggered by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself saying something that is true, which is that Shaul did this terrible thing, and there has to be some kind of atonement made for that implicitly. So how can this be, in a basic sense, if one of the major, or perhaps the major message of the Torah and Tanakh is, don't do human sacrifice, it's wrong, it's terrible, you can't do it, it's the worst thing. How can the greatest king, the archetypal Judaic king, the one from whom we learn how to have relationship with Hashem and rule in the land and all of that, how can he be the one doing this? How can he agree to it seemingly so readily when there's all of this agonizing about other things that happens elsewhere? And what is the message? Like, what is the point of that? Is it that, human sacrifice is usually bad, but in this one instance, it's okay? What is the point that's being made? So I think that there's probably different levels of a point to make about this piece that we're talking about. We haven't scratched the surface of how we connect this back to Yehoshua, what's going on there. We have to get there. But this is a piece of text that deserves consideration in its own right. So how can it be the case that things look like this? I think one of the answers is that this is Tanakh trying to say to you, how you talk about what you're doing matters tremendously, all the time, but especially in Avodat Hashem. That you can't simply say, there's a bare set of events and that's what happened, and then there's like things people say to judge that or to embellish it or whatever, and that's sort of on the surface. There's one set of events here, and just in your basic attempt to describe what's happening and why people are doing it, you could slightly differently characterize it, and it would sound like primitive ancient Near Eastern human sacrifice in a fertility cult. And the point is, because of the details that we have, it is not that at all. Right? It actually isn't. All of these coincidences are like the Givonim are temple people, and this is about a famine, but really it's actually about this terrible thing that Shaul did. It's one of these strange instances where it's like a picture of something that's being made out of other pictures that are actually of something else, right? And you can produce a form that's recognizable, but it's really being made out of completely different material that has other content. What's going on here is not that someone is saying there is a fertility god and he must be appeased and he demands human blood sacrifice, and that's what will make the land fertile, and we have to give these people over as sacrifices to his temple people and they'll take care of it. That's not what's happening. What's happening is everyone's saying there's one God, it's Hashem. Hashem judges things. What does he judge? He judges things like Shaul mass murdering a bunch of priests and maybe a bunch of innocent Givonim that were hanging out, helping out the priests, and they got swept up in it and murdered. That is the judgment, right? So it's not the fertility god desires to drink human blood and will reward you by making the land fertile. It's Hashem is angry that Shaul, the king of this land, did a terrible sin, and there hasn't been atonement for it. So that's the first point. Second point is, David is not the one who comes up with the idea of let's kill some people. Even the Kohanim are not the ones who come up with the idea. It's the Givonim, who are Goyim, right? They are not actually part of the nation. So even though they are playing the role, in a sense, of the priest-like people or the temple people who are involved in this story, they are actually the most foreign that they could possibly be while playing this role. They are temple people who are not part of the Israelite nation and maybe retain some kind of characteristics of the Canaanites. They were supposed to be wiped out. Why were they supposed to be wiped out? Because they were these nations that constantly were doing human sacrifice to Molech and everything else. And so they're even showing that characteristic a bit, right? That they are the ones demanding a sort of blood payment. And they don't want money. They don't want the kinds of compensation that you actually can put up with halfway ethically. They want blood, and they're not going to budge on that point. But the point is that that's their invention. That's their creative solution to the situation. And they're not saying they want the blood because that'll make the earth fertile. They're saying we want it because we want vengeance for what was done to us. And so it's not even a judgment on whether they're right to want it. It's just like Hashem says, you have to make amends, and they're the ones making these demands. And so now it still raises the question, can you just give in to those demands? So how can it be okay what David is doing? And there, I think you have to now look at some of the other details here. So first of all, this thing with Mephibosheth, right? There's another Mephibosheth. So there's Uncle Mephibosheth and grandson Mephibosheth. So Shaul has a son named Mephibosheth, who's the son of his concubine, and he has a grandson named Mephibosheth, who's the son of Jonathan. The fact that those names are the same is the text reminding you who David is. David, out of kindness to Jonathan, didn't touch a hair on Mephibosheth's head, the son of Jonathan. So he's not actually someone who lacks justice or who is a cruel, power-hungry murderer who's just going to go and mow down all of Shaul's family. In fact, all these people are alive that are about to be killed because David has not killed them, even though he's already been king for a while. So it's just there to show to you, like, who cares who this guy's name was? Let his name be Mephibosheth. The point is to give us the chance to say it's not the Mephibosheth that David easily could have included in this group had he wanted. And that's because David is looking at each person and their merits and demerits, and he loved Jonathan. He knew Jonathan was a tzaddik. He had relationship of friendship and a mutual regard with Jonathan. And so, in the merit of that, the Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, is spared. And that's telling you maybe the ones who are not being spared don't come out so well in that judgment, right? because at the end of the day, we have to ask the question, like, who are these people? What are they up to, right? What's a son of Shaul up to these days? David is always under threat from various kinds of dissidents and revolution, including people who want to restore the house of Shaul. We have multiple instances of that over the course of the life of David. And so that takes us to the other thing, this thing of mentioning Michal. Why Michal, right? These children are not the children of Michal. They're the children of Merav, her sister. That's clear. How is that clear? Because the first mention of this guy, Adriel, the Mecholathite, is Wahi ba'et et Merav bat Shaul leDavid, Wahi natna leAdriel ha-Mecholathi leisha. But it came to pass at the time when Merav, Shaul's daughter, should have been given to David because he killed Goliath, that she was given to Adriel, the Mecholathite, the Mecholathi, for a wife. So the woman, the daughter of Shaul, who's married to Adriel, is Merav. And then Michal is given to David, and she loves David. So when we come over here and it says, ואת חמשת בני מיכל בת שאול אשר ילדה לעדריאל ben Barzilai HaMecholathi, that's saying we're talking actually about the sons of Adriel by Merav, but we're using the name Michal instead. Again, it's like one of these games with the Mephibosheth names. It's a name game. There's a reason that the name Merav is being replaced with the name Michal here. And you can make up a story, as I believe Chazal do, where they say, oh, Merav died and Michal is, raising these children adoptively. But that just begs the question. The real point here is that the text is saying, think about what it means to call this woman Michal and not Merav. Merav is just a daughter of Shaul who went off and did something, right? Who is Michal? Michal was the queen. Michal was married to David. Michal never bore David children. If she had borne David children, they would have been candidates to sit on the throne, right? And now we're looking at these 5 children who are grandsons of Shaul, and we're being told they were, raised, or really, that they were the children of Michal. And the point is for the text to emphasize these are candidates for the throne, right? These aren't just people who hang out and enjoy the good life or something. These are people who perhaps regard themselves as candidates for the throne. And that, I think, is the way we ultimately understand David here, right? Is that the thing we should be looking at here is that all of these 7 men are still alive at the point where this story happens. But what David actually has as a pattern that we see elsewhere is he leaves people alive, but eventually, has to deal with them because they become threats, right? Like there's this guy Shimi, for example, who throws rocks at David and curses him and says that that Hashem is punishing him in the time of Avshalom's revolt. And David doesn't have him killed, even though David's military men are telling him he should. But he does mention Shimi to Shlomo, and he put, if I'm remembering this sequence of events correctly, that Shimi is on the list of people that David says, watch out for this guy. You need to get rid of this guy. I may be jumbling that up, but the point is that there's an event where Shimi has been told like he shouldn't leave Yerushalayim, and then he goes, and then he finally is executed, I believe, by Shlomo. I may be messing up some of those details, but I would say in any case, you can go back to the first event with Shimi. David doesn't have him killed, even though he is basically seditious and saying, you should be taken off your throne. And so David is actually reluctant to do that to people. But we have a nice list here of people who we might have thought would be contenders for the throne if their goal was to unseat the Davidic monarchy and return things to the house of Shaul. And so I think what you have to say, giving David the benefit of the doubt here, is that this may be an instance where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actually throwing him a lifeline. That David was doing something kind of suicidal, where he had left 7 different contenders for the throne who maybe are plotting rebellion, and there's even perhaps evidence of that and reason to fear that they might soon attack David. And David didn't touch them up to this point. And again, you could also say the mention of Mephibosheth, the mention of Michal. The point is that he has affection for this family. He loved Yonatan. He was married to Michal. Michal loved him. So even if eventually there's kind of a falling out or a separation, he has not gone after the house of Shaul, whether because of some kind of tenderheartedness of a personal nature or out of not wanting to do injustice. And so if that's the case, then maybe that was going to be his undoing, right? Maybe like if you leave 7 different men who might regard themselves as inheritors of the crown of Shaul alive, then at least one of them is going to go after you. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or maybe they're all going after you already in a sense. And David may have known that to some degree, and he was kind of hanging back and not doing anything about it. And then the Givunim come along and they say, well, our one demand is that you give us all these people who are about to start some kind of rebellion against you, and we'll kill them. And this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu kind of throwing David a lifeline. So you have to obviously have a certain kind of methodology in how you make sense of things in Tanakh to read that in, like the assumption that David is really a tzaddik. It's like with Uriah and Bathsheba. You can either look at how David deals with being a sinner and like focus on the fact that he's a sinner, or you can focus on the fact that David wouldn't have done something that was obviously murder and adultery. And so it's interesting to understand what he thought he was doing. So here similarly, you can say, what did David think he was doing? And you might say that he was overcome by some combination of, I don't know how else to deal with these Givunim, and also it so happens that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is throwing me a lifeline because I was not touching these people who were all plotting a rebellion against me. And so that's what he did. He went for it. Whether he should have or not, it's a little more complicated. But the other thing you have to see in this is that it is a discussion at some level of royal politics. And the fact that human sacrifice is always very close by when you're dealing with royal politics. Why? Because you always can make these arguments of, well, there's the state, and the state affects everyone. And if there's a civil war, then thousands of people will die. And if there's a collapse of the kingship, then maybe the whole country could be overrun by its enemies. And so the stakes are so high that you could justify almost anything for the sake of preserving the kingship, and then end up doing terrible murder as a result. Or even, the stakes can be higher because it could be there's a famine, right? If you're allowing yourself to bring in the idea that it is possible to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and find out what's going on. In this case, what's going on is that people are starving to death because nothing's being done about this issue with the Givunim. And so something has to be done. So David does it. But the point is that there's a hot route, either from the standpoint of stabilizing a kingdom, or from the standpoint of having a direct line to Hashem so that he can tell you what the problem is, so that you feel that you know that there's no other solution. Both of those things lead straight to human sacrifice. And that is part of the background here in the text, I think, as well, that there is some problem maybe with the fact that David has this ephod or has some way of consulting with Hashem and just saying, oh, there's a famine? Well, what does Hashem say is the reason for the famine? That sounds like it must be great, that Hashem will give you an answer that will help you solve your problems faster. But in this case, it seems Hashem gave him an answer that put him on a fast track to something that looked very much like human sacrifice. And that reminds of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, right? That Avram talks to Hashem. And when you talk to Hashem, you can end up being in these situations where you're putting something in this world against the will of Hashem. And it's like the will of Hashem always wins, but then that can, cause you to be doing something that you either shouldn't be doing or is very close to doing something that you shouldn't be doing because of the abhorrentness of human sacrifice. So all of that is just focusing on only this bit of text. And I think it's just interesting to pull that all out, that, it is at some level not human sacrifice in the narrow sense in which it at first appears, but the text wants to take David above all and say, look, this is the guy you would never suspect of pagan human sacrifice. He is the paragon of proper faith in Hashem, and he wants to do the right thing, and he's not cruel, and he's not brutal unnecessarily. And with all of that, he still ends up doing something that could be construed as terribly wrong. And the streams that are feeding that event are the necessities of politics on the one hand, and the idea of being able to directly communicate with the creator of the world about why your problems are coming to your doorstep, and implicitly, therefore, what you can do about them. So both are very important lessons that Tanakh wants to use this episode with David to teach. With all of that being said, what we now have to ask ourselves is, how do we get from here back to where we started out? Like, what does this have to do with Yeshua? What does this have to do more broadly with the Givonim? And this Hayashar, the book of Jasher, or doing what's good and straight, or straight and good in Hashem's eyes. And so now I think what we have to do is zoom out a bit on King Shaul and say, well, what is it that Shaul really was doing here? And what was his more general failure as a king? And maybe then, that helps us to connect the dots a bit more. So, Shaul, when he was trying to kill the Kohanim, of course, in some sense, it was about stabilizing his kingship. And he would have justified it in those terms, right? Like everything for the sake of retaining the kingship, because otherwise everything falls apart. But what he actually did was he killed a city full of Kohanim. And so just the idea that he could be willing to do that, it's all too easy to imagine that Shaul is just bad and that he would therefore do that. But he was the anointed of Hashem. He was a king over Israel because of his good qualities. So if we have to understand it in those terms, that it's like, how could he do what he did? The fact that he's killing Kohanim, I think, is important, because that's consistent actually with how he loses the kingship in the first place. This event that first triggers Shmuel telling him that Hashem has abandoned him happens in Sefer Shmuel, Aleph, in Perek Yud Gimel. So we have this situation where Shaul is waiting for Shmuel to come, and he's worried the people in his army are going to disperse and the Plishtim are going to attack them. And so he can't wait for Shmuel anymore, and he just performs a sacrifice himself as a king. And then Shmuel says to him, Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul, Nizkarta lo shamarta et mitzvat Adonai Elohecha asher tzivach, ki ata hechin Adonai et mamlachtecha el Yisrael ad olam. Wa'ata mamlachtecha lo taqum bikresh Adonai lo ish, ki levavo v'yetzaweo Adonai lenagid al amo, כי לא שמרת את אשר ציווך אדוני. Okay, so Shmuel said to Shaul, "You've done foolishly. You've not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom upon Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be captain over his people, because you have not kept that which the Lord commanded you." So we're talking about the rise of David and the fall of Shaul, about this issue. What is the issue? Well, in a narrow sense, it's like a loss of faithfulness to procedure. The Kohanim were supposed to perform the sacrifices, or Shmuel, who is effectively a Kohen by being a Navi, who is raised inside the temple of Shilo by Eli the Kohen. So Shmuel is effectively a Kohen. He would have done the sacrifice. The king is not supposed to do the sacrifices. So the same way with Shaul killing the Kohanim, here Shaul is doing the sacrifices himself. There's a problem with his whole understanding of what it is to do Avodat Hashem. In one sense, Shaul is concerned about serving Hashem. There's this instance where the people are hungry from fasting, and they, eat a bunch of animals with their blood, and Shaul rebukes them and says what a terrible thing it is that they've done this sin against Hashem. So he is aware of things of ritual significance. He doesn't care about that. He just wants power or something. And interestingly, by the way, the word hayashar appears multiple times in the Torah in connection with not eating blood. So there's something about hayashar that evokes those kinds of commands from Hashem, and yet it obviously has this more expansive idea as well of just like do the right thing. What does it mean to do the right thing? Well, Shaul, he wants to do the right thing. He also wants to serve Hashem, but he views Hashem as a tool for making him a successful battle leader and king and making his people flourish, right? That yes, we have Kohanim and yes, we have sacrifices, but what I ultimately need the sacrifice for is to keep the people together so we can win the battle. And if we don't have a Kohen, then I'll just do the sacrifice and we'll get it done. He misunderstands the purpose and value of the avodah, of the sacrifice. And so similarly, it's like, well, if the Kohanim are, helping David, then they are my political enemies, and now I just want to get rid of them, and they're not a plus, they're a minus, and so we get rid of them. He's viewing the whole sacrificial cult and all of its rules and rituals as a means to the success that he wants to embody as a king. And if it flies in the face of his plan for success, then it can be canceled or avoided or eliminated or destroyed. If that's who Shaul is, then I think you can say at some level, then Shaul's ultimate failing is to not understand at all what the purpose of Am Yisrael is, right? Because it's putting it upside down. Shaul is saying, oh, well, we have all these mitzvot, and we have the kiunah and the sacrifices and everything, and that is because that gives us our direct connection to the one true God. And if we have that connection, then he will make us successful, he will make us powerful, and then I can protect his people in their land, and that will be the happy ending to the story. But that's not the happy ending to the story. The happy ending to the story is the opposite. It's that if we have a good king who wants to serve Hashem properly, and he keeps the Torah, and he uses his kingship as a battering ram to make space for true Avodat Hashem, which is what David and Shlomo do, right? They use the Judaic kingship with all of its might and with all of its military success and economic success. They use that to create a temple for Hashem, not so that they can then even just kind of have sacrifices in their temple for themselves. They already had a tabernacle, right? What is the purpose of the temple? The purpose of the temple is for all mankind to have a place that can help them to connect to Hashem. So the happy ending of the story doesn't end with Israel flourishing. It ends with Israel serving its purpose. its God-given purpose, the reason for which it was created, which is to be a beacon, right? To be a society that can show by example how to have proper relationship with Hashem, to be a society that can build and operate a temple that is a place for all humankind to come and experience Hashem's presence, right? So if we view it in those terms, then it's clear that that's Shaul's problem. Shaul is not like David and Shlomo because he doesn't understand that he is a means to the end, which is connection with Hashem and avodat Hashem for all humankind. That even he and his whole nation are a means, and they have to be a willing tool in Hashem's hand to do the right thing. He shouldn't be using the Kihonah and the temple and relationship with Hashem as a tool for his people, but rather the reverse. And that, I think, is going to help get us back to this whole thing with Givon and also explaining what happens with Yehoshua. Because, I'll mention, interestingly, that in the same passage that we were talking about, with the Battle of Michmash and this whole thing where Shaul kind of loses the kingship, there's all these mentions of Gilgal as a place, and also there's mention of Beit Horon. Gilgal and Beit Horon are the geography of what's going on with Yehoshua in exactly the time of this whole episode with the sun and the moon. So we should go over there now because I think we're primed, we're ready to understand now what the other connections are here. Like we understand the general problem with Shaul. We understand maybe how that's related to how he killed some Givonim. And also maybe we see in turn some interesting things about what happened with David atoning for the sort of sins of Saul. But we haven't quite been able to pull it together with that passage with David and the sons of Saul, and what does that have to do with Yehoshua more directly? And can we bring it all together? And so now we have to look at what happens with Yehoshua. So Yehoshua, there's this famous line, right? Shemesh b'givon dom v'yorech be'emek ayalon. Let the sun dome, I'll say, but let the sun stand. It's not the right word, or stop. It's not the right word. In Givon, and the moon be'emek ayalon, in the Ayalon Valley, which in present-day Israel is near Modi'in. So, what is going on there in this story when the sun stands still for Yehoshua? What is that? So the backstory is this thing that has just happened with the Givonim, where they committed themselves to Hashem, and then the Canaanites say, well, now you're traitors. Now our first job is to wipe you out because you've betrayed us and joined the Israelites. And so they're going to go to Givon and they're going to kill the people there. And punish them in a sense for this oath that they swore to Israel. So now Givon reaches out to Yehoshua and says that they're afraid, and so it's Vaya'ad Yehoshua min ha-Gilgal hu v'chol ha'am ha'milchama imo v'chol giborei ha'il Vayomer Adonai el Yehoshua al tira mehem Ki biyadcha natatim lo ya'amod ish mehem bifanecha. All right, so Yehoshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Yehoshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them to your hand. There shall not be a man of them standing before you. Vayavo alehem Yehoshua pitom kol halayla ala min ha-Gilgal. And Yehoshua therefore came to them suddenly and went up from Gilgal all night. Okay, so now, Vayihumem Adonai lifnei Yisrael, Vayakem makah gedola b'Givon, Vayirdefem derech Ma'ale, Bet Horon, Vayakem ad Azekah ve'ad Makeda. And the Lord struck them with confusion before Israel and slew them with a great slaughter at Givon and chased them away along that ascends to Bet Horon and struck them as far as Azekah and Makeda. So when you're talking about Azekah, that's like down south. Tel Azekah, it's like down towards where David fought Goliath, more in the Eretz Yehuda region, south of Hamakai Alon. Meanwhile, Givon is like Givat Zev, maybe that area, sort of on the road, like along the 443 going down from Jerusalem to Modi'in. You have Givon or Givat Zev, assuming that you can cite Givon there, but it makes sense with the rest of the trajectory. Beit Horon is after that. And then you're going down to Azekah, which is, going south. So that's the progression. You're kind of going east to west, and maybe, with north and south varying a bit, but essentially east to west, from north of Jerusalem over towards Modi'in and sort of past it down further south through Mekayelon to Tel Azekah. So if you talk in those terms, that actually gives you a bit of a sense of where different things are going to be in the sky when things happen. But already we should just say, like, Hashem is saying to Yeshua, there's no problem here. I'm going to take care of everything. Why is Hashem so willing to take care of everything? I think you have to argue it's because it's the Givonim. The Givonim are non-Israelites who've committed themselves to Israel and Hashem. And then the rest of the non-Israelites are going to gang up and try to wipe them out. And this is just a very bright, clear case where Kadosh Baruch Hu, based on what we were saying before about Shaul, he's going to look at the Givonim and he's going to say, this is what we're trying to make happen, right? We're trying to bring people who were formerly the enemies of Israel and of Hashem into the fold of the Israelite system, of the Judaic system, of the Torah system, and that they're doing that willingly, that it wasn't even like they weren't converted by the sword or something. They went out of their way to trick Yehoshua into letting them become a part of it because they were so eager. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to reward and protect that eagerness to join the team, right? So humankind as a whole has not joined the team, but a portion of it has. There's a broader portion that wants to now wipe them out, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, okay, now this is really the time where I put my foot down, right? Like never otherwise, maybe anywhere else in Tanakh, I'll put my foot down that much because the point of Yahadut, of Torah, is this goal, is to bring humankind into the fold willingly and eagerly, like the Givonim. And for the sake of that example, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will turn the whole world upside down, right? He'll stop the sun and the moon in the sky, although we'll revisit that issue. But I think that is, something we're so fascinated by this sort of supposed astronomical event that it's like, who cares exactly why this is happening? No. Shemesh b'Givon dom, that the sun shall stand in Givon, v'yareach be'emek Ayalon, and the moon in Ayalon Valley, that it's in Givon. It's about the Givonim. It's about who they are and what they represent going forward for the rest of time. And it's about the fact that they are this talisman of the whole point of Torah and the whole point of Am Yisrael is to, bring about Givonim and protect them. What could be like a better statement of the sort of whole mission of Am Yisrael? So we get to this point, and it's now Kadosh Baruch Hu just steps in and fixes it all. Wahi benusam mipnei Yisrael hem b'morad beit Horon wa Adonai hishlich aleihem avanim gidolot min hashamayim ad Azekah wa yamutu rabim asher metu be'avnei habarad me'asher hargu b'nei Yisrael b'cherev. And it came to pass, as they fled from before Yisrael and were in the descent to Beit Horon, that the Lord threw down great stones from heaven upon them as far as Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died from hailstones than there were killed with the sword by the people of Israel. And so now they're routing them, and Yeshua once more times says, "Az yidaber Yehoshua l'Adonai biyom tet Adonai et Emori lifnei bnei Yisrael vayomer le'einei Yisrael shemesh b'givon dom u'yareach ba'emek Ayalon vayidom hashemesh u'yareach amad ad yikom goy oivav halo hi ktuva al sefer hayashar vayamud hashemesh b'chatzi hashamayim v'lo atz lavo kayom tamim." Okay, so then spoke Yoshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered the Amorites and before the people of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still upon Givon, and you, moon, in the valley of Ayalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Yashar? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day. So I want to take issue with the translation of it. And we can do that in a second. But first, just to point out another issue here. So this barad, what is this barad? Barad means heavy, round objects that kill people falling from the sky. Okay, barad, maybe, it's translated as hailstones, but I really don't think that we necessarily know that it's hail in this case, like it's ice that forms by a certain process in the clouds. And I think if we're going to, make some sense of shemesh b'givon dom, and vayidom hashemesh, and the sun, what? It did something. When we combine that with the question of exactly what the barad is, I think we have a different way of reading this than we sometimes go with. It's usually talked about like this is about time and the passage of time and the sun and the moon not moving. But I like to suggest an alternative possibility here, which is just that this is about, let's say, I don't know, meteors or some kind of rocks falling from the sky that are not balls of ice, but instead are much more astronomical than that. Why is that interesting? Because if this were some kind of shower of objects like that from the sky, there could be a period during which, if there's enough of them, you have the sun being blocked out. And I think that might be a more interesting way of reading Shemesh B'Givon Dom or Vayidom HaShemesh. We have precedent for this, okay? Vayidom Aharon is what we have when Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, are killed. And Moshe speaks to him, and then it says Vayidom Aaron. That's Aaron being silent, right? He's not talking. He's not expressing himself in the way he normally does. And if the sun is not expressing itself, I don't necessarily think that means it's not moving. I think it means maybe it disappears or it goes dark. It becomes muted, right? A muting of the sun might be more like it's suddenly very dark there's a big asteroid going in front of the sunway, like that there's an asteroid belt or whatever, a cloud of asteroid-like objects that's going by. One of them is blocking the sun for a while. There's a bunch of smaller ones that are falling all over the place and really, doing some damage as we read. And that, I think, is consistent with the idea of, and the moon, Amad, Hayireach Amad, right? Vayidom HaShemesh ve'yareach Amad, ad yikum goy oivav. There's a sense of, and the moon stood. Well, the moon could stand like stop again, or it could be that the moon stood up, meaning the moon wasn't really visible beforehand and it became visible because it got dark. Givon, again, if we read Givon as being like Givat Zev, which I think is consistent with going down through Beit Horon to Emek Ayalon, then for the moon to be in Emek Ayalon, that's in the west. That's like where the sun is going to set eventually, but where the moon might set first. If the moon's over there, the moon is going to set before the sun. If the moon is setting before the sun's, high up in the sky, you wouldn't normally see the moon so well in a bright sky if it is setting a quarter turn ahead of the moon. Ahead of the sun. But the moon can become much more visible if the sun suddenly becomes dark, and there's still light from the sun reaching the moon, so the moon can be bright, but the sun is blocked, so you see the moon better and the sun is muted. And that becomes an event where it could last for however long it lasts. There's some period of time during which the sun is blocked, at least partially, maybe almost fully. So the sky is darkened. You see the moon as the moon is setting for a while. It's not actually very far away from the sun in the sky, but it's towards Emek Ayalon relative to where you are in Beit Horon, and it becomes visible. It stays visible. It stands in the sky visible for a long time. And all while you have these meteorites or whatever blasting the enemy to bits. It doesn't have to be that. Obviously, there's obviously always more than one way of reading things like this. But I think the point is that this particular passage provokes people to ask this question of how can it be that something like this would happen? What are the other physical consequences of this? Because it says, "V'lo haya kayom hahu lifanav ve'acharav lishmo'a Adonai b'kol ish ki Adonai nilham liYisrael." And there was no day like that before it or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So I think that, like we said before about the Givonim, in one sense, the answer is, why is Hashem making this that special day where he listens to Yehoshua and does what he says? How is it that this is the most special day in all of human history at some level, as far as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's willingness to show his hand, reaching in and just saying, this is the side that I'm on? It's because of the Givonim. It's because the Givonim represent the ultimate point of Am Yisrael and Torah, which is to bring all of humanity to knowledge of Hashem and service of Hashem through their willingness to seize on that possible relationship. And so the Givonim are threatened, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, this is going to be very simple today. It's not usually the case that a whole gaggle of asteroids is going to fly through and obliterate the enemy of Israel in spectacular fashion, in a way that seems like things are happening in the heavens that never happened. But I'll do that today because I have a point to make. But I also think, just as an aside, when we start asking questions, taking a more standard reading of what happened here, where it's like the sun stopped moving and the moon stopped moving, as though the earth stopped rotating for a while. Because you can always imagine, okay, Kadosh Baruch Hu turned off the earth's rotation for a little bit, but then you started worrying, and it's well, but what happened to the tides? Or what happened to the things that normally require the earth to rotate? And when the earth stopped rotating, they would no longer be doing the thing that they would be doing. What about the winds? How are they affected by the non-rotation of the earth? And you can start spinning all these stories. And I think there's a fundamental issue there, which is that if you're going to accept the premise that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Borei Olam, and he reaches in and temporarily alters the laws of physics in such a fashion that he can make the earth stop turning or make the sun and the moon stop seeming to move through the sky or whatever else, to then ask, but how is that possible with regard to other things that are about the world functioning naturally? The answer always can just be, oh yeah, no, Hashem took care of that too, because he can. And there's no argument against that. It's just kind of unsatisfying because we're disposed to think that reality requires a kind of natural order, and then we want to kind of situate what's happening as much in the natural order as possible, even when something seemingly totally unnatural is happening. And I think that there's sort of a mistake there. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oseh bereshit. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekocho ugvuato malei olam. Just had some thunder and lightning. So I think the point is that Hashem makes Maaseh Bereshit, right? He's the maker of everything. He decides when lightning strikes, and he decides everything else as well. And at one level, you just can explain everything in the story by affirming that and saying, if he can make one thing happen, he can make another thing happen, and we don't have to worry about squaring the circle with all the other, Coriolis effects or tides or whatever else. We're not sure, what the impact would be. It's whatever he writes the book to say, so to speak, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I also think that there's no reason to assume that the text is actually saying the sun and the moon stopped. I think that if you are willing enough to reconsider how some of those passages are translated, then you realize there really are different options there. And I think that the reason I'm focused on the one I mentioned with the asteroids is because I think it calls our attention to the Barad in a way that really we usually kind of miss there. Like, it's so remarkable, the sun and the moon stopping, that we kind of forget there was this other thing also where Kadosh Baruch Hu obliterated the enemy with Barad, with hail, as it's translated. But I think the point is that really the hail is the key thing there. That is what Hashem did. And the other stuff is consequences of that. Now, why is that important? It's important because what is the Barad in Mitzrayim? What is the hail at the time of the plagues? The Barad is the seventh plague. It's the plague when Hashem and Moshe warn Mitzrayim about what's coming, and the tzaddikim, the righteous, bring their animals inside, and they stay inside, and they're spared. But those who didn't heed Hashem and were outdoors, they were killed in the Barad. And that is a significant point because we're talking about exactly that kind of situation here. What's going on here? There's righteous people, the Givonim, who decided to join sides with Israel, and there's not righteous people who are trying to wipe them out, and there's Barad, and the Barad destroys the not righteous people. And it's not just like a statement about the sort of magical properties of hailstones, okay? It's about saying there is judgment of mankind on earth by the world's creator. It's why it's the seventh plague. It's about the number 7, which is the number of creation, the number of Maaseh Bereshit. It's contrasted with the 10 plagues in toto, because 7 is the number of Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. There are 7 commandments given by Hashem to mankind. There are 10 Aseret HaDibrot that represent the whole Torah. These 10 commandments that are given at Har Sinai. So there's this sense of there's 10 plagues for Am Yisrael, but the 7th plague is about Hashem's judgment of all mankind, that there are the tzaddikim and the not tzaddikim, and Hashem obliterates one without obliterating the other. And he shows his supremacy over nature from Shamayim, that everything else was kind of going on the ground, and then he just steps in with Barad, and bang. There's this supremacy of the divine will as king and creator and judge. And one last little bit of detail that I notice here, this will help us to get back where we're going to, is when the Barad destroys in Mitzrayim, it says, "V'hapishta v'hase'ora nukta ki hase'ora aviv v'hapishta giva'ol." Okay? The flax and the barley were ruined, for the barley was an ear and the flax was bud. So this is about the barley harvest being affected by the hailstones. What were we talking about before with the barley harvest? Yes, this story with David and this sort of the killing of the sons of Shaul, the 7 sons of Shaul, who struck the Givonim. And this word Giv'ol at the end of this pasuk, is a word for the budding of the flax. But Givon it evokes Givon, it evokes Gilboa, which is like where we started out, where Shaul and Yonatan are being mourned and eulogized by David on Gilboa, which is just a rearrangement of the letters of Givon. But just this idea of the barley harvest is what the story with David and Shaul is about. And it's also here what the Barad is about. So, it takes a bit of connecting the dots, but the Barad is central to the story of Yeshua and the Givonim. The Givonim are central to the story of David and the sons of Shaul, which also is about the barley harvest. And when we go to the Barad in Mitzrayim, there's this mention of something that sounds like Gilboa or Givon, and also mention of the Barad. And I think when you add it all up, it's pretty clear. I think you maybe can connect the verb of striking, of like nukta, to all three of those passages as well, if I remember correctly. So it's almost too much to kind of hold in memory at once, and it requires, or I would say it's rewarding to really engage in study of all these sources together, and you see more and more and more and more connections with the Givonim, Shaul, David, Barad, barley, which is Seorah, and Yehoshua, and the sun and the moon standing. And I think we've already mostly made the point about the centrality of Givon and the Givonim at the middle of all of this. But I think you even could pile onto that thesis with this word Seorah for barley, because the word for barley is like Seir, which is the name of Edom. Edom is the nation descended from Esav. It was the brother of Yaakov. It was Doeg, the Edomi, the Edomite, who killed all the priests in Nov, and implicitly also the Givonim for Shaul. And the Seorah, the barley, if we can connect it to Seir, I think the key point there is that really is the parting of ways. Seir and Edom and Esav, they represent the separation of Am Yisrael from the rest of humanity, right? That was the moment where you have the choosing of Am Yisrael. The Har Sinai moment, so to speak, is prefigured in that separation of the ways of these two brothers, and that is, where we should come back to in the end is this idea that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu separates Am Yisrael from the rest of humanity, he's not doing it because he's just saying, I like these people more, I like these other people less, I'll just hang out with these people that I like more, and they can be in a bubble and separate themselves from the rest and do their own thing. That's not it at all. It's in a sense the opposite of that. There is no purpose to Am Yisrael existing except in Hashem's eyes, we learn from the Torah, so that we can be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, so that we can play a role that is about bringing all of humankind to knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the way that mechanism works is complicated. It's not about a sort of quick conversion where you have a conversation over coffee and then someone recites a few words and now they become something. And it's not about even also making them Jews and making them Israelites and making them keep the whole Torah. It's about the Torah being a discipline we impose on ourselves so that it gives us the tools we need in order to help the rest of the world find relationship with Hashem, both in terms of our example and the way we live and what we can teach about that, and also through what we do in Yerushalayim, in the temple. Because as Yeshayahu says, Beiti Beit Tfilah Yikareh Lechol Ha'amim, right? My house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So we're talking about the creation of a place where one can know and experience the presence of Hashem that is not just for Am Yisrael. It's curated, or it's operated, it's constructed, it's defended It's supervised, it's overseen by Am Yisrael, who have to keep the Torah in order to know how to do that. But it is not for Am Yisrael only. It is for everyone. It is for everyone to get to know Hashem. And Givon is a first hint that that's the case. Because it's not even just about, oh, this is where the tabernacle was, or where people did something like avodah. It's about a nation that wasn't Israelite, that chose to attach itself to Torah, to Israel, to Hashem, and to, in their way, serve Hashem. And that if we can build on that model and build on that example, then that's how we achieve the ultimate objective of human existence in history, according to the Torah and according to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's instruction and message for us. And for the sake of that merit of the Givonim, and for the sake of Am Yisrael's willingness to defend the Givonim and support them, as Yehoshua showed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is willing to make his most brazen and stunning wonder, perhaps of all of Tanakh. And he does it not lightly or arbitrarily, but rather to show us that this is the fulcrum, this is the center, this is the pivot about which this whole story and therefore all of existence really turns.